The 11th wedding anniversary was intended as a monument to stability, a quiet affirmation of 2 decades spent meticulously building a shared existence. For the woman at the center of this domestic ritual, the day was colored by the familiar warmth of routine and the subtle contentment that comes from enduring partnership. The setting was the familiar quiet of their suburban home, with a subtle scent of expensive cedar and remnants of a celebratory dinner lingered in the air. This was the landscape of her certainty, a canvas upon which every subsequent year was expected to be painted with the same predictable, comforting hues. Her husband, a man whose professional life demanded prolonged absences and meticulous excuses concerning demanding corporate schedules, had returned late, yet his presence was a reassuring weight. It was in the aftermath of their quiet celebration, while tidying the vestiges of the evening, that the facade cracked, not with a sudden explosion, but with the quiet, devastating sound of paper unfolding. She reached into the inner pocket of his discarded jacket, a gesture of domestic care, intending only to retrieve a loose receipt or perhaps his keys. Instead, her fingers brushed against an unfamiliar, stiff cardstock. The stationery was elegant, bearing a faint floral watermark, immediately suggesting an intimacy far removed from the cold formality of business communication. As the lamplight illuminated the cursive script, the air thickened, and the familiar architecture of her world began its silent collapse. The opening salutation, devoid of any professional pretense, delivered the seismic truth. Happy anniversary to us both. This single, meticulously preserved artifact, a piece of primary source evidence hidden within the very fabric of their shared life, instantaneously transformed years of perceived truth into a calculated illusion. The letter detailed shared moments, promises made in secret, and referenced a parallel history unfolding simultaneously alongside her own marriage. It was a secondary chronology, meticulously documented and preserved, directly contradicting the narrative she had accepted as reality. The ensuing shock was less about the existence of the betrayal and more about the scale of the deceit. The narrative that unfolded from that moment was not merely a story of infidelity, but an intense examination of proximity and collective silence. Who was the author of this note, this collaborator in the hidden timeline? The immediate investigation, driven by a raw necessity for factual clarity, quickly revealed that the other woman was not a distant figure, relegated to anonymous hotel rooms or fleeting business trips. She was embedded within the protagonist's orbit, a familiar face, a presence welcomed into the home during a period of genuine vulnerability years prior. The discovery transcended personal injury. It became an archival deep dive into the complicity of the surrounding world. This was the moment the protagonist moved from being a participant in a marriage to an investigative historian of her own life. The seemingly insignificant details, the late calls, the vague weekend commitments, the strained avoidance of certain family gatherings, all snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. The narrative of the stressed executive was replaced by the documented history of the double life. The greatest horror was not the deception of the husband, but the realization that this hidden architecture of lies had been silently upheld by a network of acquaintances, family members, and friends who chose the comfortable anonymity of silence over the painful truth. This silence was the unique cruelty of the situation, suggesting that the integrity of the lie had been deemed more valuable than the well-being of the betrayed. The journey ahead demanded a forensic approach, a meticulous sifting through the wreckage of trust to find the unwavering foundation of self that lay buried beneath the rubble of years of deliberate misdirection. This was the necessary first step toward reclaiming not just a life, but the undisputed authorship of her future. The initial hours following the discovery were characterized by a cold, analytical detachment, a survival mechanism replacing the expected rush of shock and grief. The protagonist, whose name became synonymous with resilience in the subsequent months, did not immediately confront the source of the deception. Instead, she initiated a period of intense, solitary investigation. This was a process of historical validation, turning her private pain into verifiable data. The letter, designated as Exhibit A, confirmed a dual anniversary, marking a specific date. Not the day of her own wedding, but a distinct temporal marker suggesting the start of the parallel commitment. Her methodology involved a forensic examination of their shared digital landscape. Accessing calendars, Reviewing historical bank statements and cross-referencing mobile phone records, she began mapping the geography of the deceit. The husband's travel itinerary, once accepted as unavoidable corporate necessity, revealed patterns of consistent rendezvous. The vague expense reports, previously dismissed as administrative clutter, now delineated specific hotels and restaurant reservations in cities where no genuine business necessity existed. These records, dating back several years, provided the rigorous documentation necessary to dismantle the fiction of a recent lapse in judgment. The betrayal was not a moment, but a structure maintained with bureaucratic precision. The identity of the woman who wrote the letter proved to be the most chilling data point. She was not a stranger, but a figure known intimately to the family, a former colleague and friend who had relied on the protagonist's kindness during a time of personal crisis years earlier. The protagonist had extended professional mentorship and domestic hospitality, viewing the relationship as a compassionate extension of her own stable life. The archival evidence now indicated that this period of vulnerability, meant to be a refuge, had been systematically exploited. The affair had begun under the very roof of the marital home, sustained by the husband's calculated manipulation of domestic opportunity and the guest's profound lack of boundaries. The investigation revealed that the intimacy between the two was not merely emotional or physical, it was deeply interwoven with the protagonist's own life. They had attended the same family gatherings, shared meals at the same table, and exchanged polite pleasantries, all while harboring a secret timeline that mocked the hostess's generosity. This level of sustained infiltration transformed the narrative from standard infidelity into a psychological violation, a complex act of domestic espionage that relied on the absolute trust of the victim. The physical artifacts gathered during this period, digital communications that referenced shared inside jokes, gifts purchased under the guise of work expenses, and the calculated overlaps in their schedules, formed a powerful, incontrovertible historical record. This documented history demonstrated the profound logistical effort required to sustain such a sophisticated lie. It was a narrative of sustained, deliberate choice, suggesting that the husband's actions were less about passion and more about maintaining control over two separate, meticulously managed realities. The true shock wave, however, extended beyond the central relationship. As the protagonist sifted through the evidence, contextualizing the long absences and abrupt behavioral changes of her husband, she began to notice external anomalies. A fleeting glance from a longtime acquaintance, an overly defensive posture adopted by a sibling when questioned about the husband's whereabouts, and the sudden, manufactured distance maintained by certain close friends. The archival data suggested that the knowledge of the affair was not strictly bilateral, confined to the husband and the mistress, but multilateral, encompassing a silent circle of confidence. This realization introduced the element of sociological betrayal. The protagonist's community, the very network intended to provide support and honesty, had tacitly agreed to uphold the lie. They had witnessed the deception, possessed the critical knowledge, and yet chose to prioritize the husband's reputation or their own comfort over the truth. This institutional silence made the protagonist's journey uniquely isolating. She was forced to confront the fact that her emotional reality had been systematically negated by an entire social structure designed to protect the status quo of the deceit. The investigation reached its inevitable culmination when the protagonist possessed a complete, verifiable chronology of the parallel life, spanning 6 years and crossing numerous geopolitical boundaries referenced in the travelogues. Armed with this robust historical record, the confrontation was transformed from an emotional outpouring into a forensic presentation. It was not a plea for explanation, but a delivery of the documented truth, requiring only the husband's acknowledgement of the facts already established. The moment of confrontation was detached, clinical. The evidence, the dated correspondence, the synchronized travel vouchers, the financial records documenting hidden expenditures, was presented not as accusation, but as irrefutable proof. The husband, faced with the meticulously compiled historical file, offered the only response possible, a confirmation of the chronology. He admitted the parallel relationship had evolved from fleeting connection to a long-term emotional and structural entanglement. The mistress had been promised a future, a commitment perpetually delayed by the husband's paralyzing inability to dismantle his primary, stable life. His explanation, filtered through the objective lens of the protagonist's newfound detachment, focused on fear, the fear of social censure, the fear of financial disintegration, and the fundamental cowardice of choosing concealment over honest resolution. He had maintained the dual identity not out of love for either party, but out of a desperate, selfish need to maintain all his accumulated assets, both financial and emotional, simultaneously. He was, in essence, an archivist of his own lies, unable to discard any volume from his complicated library of self-deception. This analysis provided the protagonist with a crucial insight, separating her worth from his actions. The betrayal was revealed not as a measure of her inadequacy, but as a testament to his profound moral insolvency. This cognitive restructuring was the first stage of her emotional liberation. The question ceased to be, "Why did he do this to me?" and transformed into, "What structural mechanism allowed this man to believe this was sustainable?" The analysis extended to the societal narrative surrounding betrayal. The conventional wisdom often frames the betrayed partner as a passive victim, broken and seeking emotional restitution. The protagonist consciously rejected this framework. She recognized that the true power lay not in seeking revenge or emotional reconciliation, but in seizing control of the narrative and the material assets that had been intertwined with the deception. The accumulated evidence became her leverage, transforming her from a victim into a principal player in the dissolution of the fraudulent contract. A deeper consideration of the silent circle was necessary. Scholarly perspectives on social complicity suggest that groups often prioritize systemic preservation, maintaining the appearance of familial integrity over individual truth. The friends and family who remained silent did so to protect the shared, comfortable reality, sacrificing the protagonist's emotional well-being for the ease of their social navigation. This perspective revealed the betrayal as a collective failure of moral courage, a commentary on the fragility of authenticity within tight-knit communities. The husband's sustained deception was only made possible by the passive authorization granted by those who knew the truth and chose neutrality. The investigation yielded profound, personal growth, forcing the protagonist to confront the uncomfortable reality of her own history, the moments she had unknowingly minimized or rationalized her husband's suspicious behavior. This self-analysis was not self-blame, but an acknowledgement of the profound human capacity for denial, particularly when the truth threatens the foundational security of life. By accepting this past blindness without judgment, she strengthened her resolve to ensure absolute clarity in her future interactions. The emotional severing was swift and definitive, driven by the intellectual understanding of the sustained malice rather than the immediate sting of hurt. The relationship had become a case study in psychological fraud, and her response had to be equally strategic. She initiated legal proceedings, utilizing the meticulously collected archival documentation, the travel logs, the timestamped communications, the dated letter, as irrefutable proof of the long-term, calculated nature of the deception. This objective presentation of facts expedited the resolution, forcing a material reckoning based on evidence rather than emotional arguments. The dismantling of the shared life was executed with the same forensic precision as the investigation itself. Every shared asset, every responsibility was methodically separated. The home, once the stage for the deception, became the site of her reconstruction. She consciously reframed the physical space, purging not just artifacts of the marriage, but also the lingering atmospheric tension of the lie. The process was one of deconstruction followed by immediate, self-directed creation. In the ensuing months, the protagonist focused relentlessly on defining her independence. She returned to professional endeavors she had minimized during the marriage, leveraged her organizational strengths, and built a new social circle founded on verified mutual respect and transparent communication. The experience, while devastating, had acted as a radical clarifying agent, stripping away all superficial connections and emotional dependencies. She had moved beyond merely surviving the betrayal. She was thriving because of the necessary, painful self-knowledge it had engendered. The final act of separation was less about the legal decree and more about the internal declaration of autonomy. She had successfully navigated the wreckage, gathered the evidence of her own pain, and utilized that documentation not as a source of prolonged victimhood, but as the blueprint for an unassailable future. The power of the betrayer was neutralized entirely, not through confrontation or reconciliation, but through the protagonist's profound demonstration that the narrative of her life belonged solely to her. She had chosen resilience, proving that the value of a woman is not defined by the fidelity of her partner, but by the fortitude of her own spirit and the truth she insists upon maintaining. The conclusion of this intense period of investigation and reconstruction yielded two fundamental findings. Firstly, the betrayal was structural, an edifice built on systematic concealment, demonstrating that long-term deception requires the maintenance of two parallel lives rather than sporadic moral failure. Secondly, the protagonist's emotional recovery was accelerated by the decision to prioritize fact-based investigation over emotional paralysis, transforming historical evidence into strategic leverage. She moved from accepting a comfortable lie to demanding a difficult, but profoundly honest truth. This journey, marked by archival rigor and intellectual clarity, provided a powerful, universal lesson that the greatest strength is found not in avoiding pain, but in utilizing painful truths as the catalyst for transformation. The meticulous reconstruction of her life served as a testament to the indestructible nature of self-determination. The story became a living document of personal sovereignty, demonstrating that even the most meticulously constructed lies ultimately dissolve under the relentless pressure of forensic truth. The experience of having the world she built shattered by a hidden history forced the protagonist to evaluate the core components of trust, intimacy, and communal responsibility. She learned that vulnerability must be protected by boundaries, and that silence, in the face of known deceit, constitutes a form of participation in the injustice. Her liberation was defined by the definitive end of her complicity in the lie, a powerful severance that allowed her to author a future free from the constraints of another person's moral cowardice. The narrative of the victim was permanently replaced by the chronicle of the architect, building a new, verifiable life on solid, unshakable ground. She had proven that no betrayal, regardless of its duration or cruelty, possessed the power to define her inherent worth or limit her potential for profound happiness. The strength she discovered was not residual from the past, but entirely self-generated, forged in the very fires of her investigation. Her reflection on this painful period inevitably leads to a single, essential question regarding the complexities and vulnerabilities inherent in human connection. It is a query rooted not in the details of her own unique experience, but in the universal fragility of committed relationships. As we witness the meticulous process of her emotional and physical reconstruction, one must consider the fundamental points of fracture that exist within any bond of deep trust. This documentary exploration of personal crisis, therefore, transcends the individual story to probe the collective human condition, prompting a wider consideration of relational risk and the mechanisms of personal defense against devastating revelation. We are left, then, to contemplate the core vulnerabilities we carry into partnership, the risks we unconsciously accept in exchange for intimacy. What is your greatest vulnerability when it comes to relationships? The intellectual framework underpinning her new existence was not predicated upon forgiveness, but upon the uncompromising pursuit of personal clarity. Having meticulously dissolved the marital estate, her subsequent endeavor focused on creating a self-sustaining intellectual fortress. She recognized that the true danger of the preceding years lay in the cession of her own critical judgment, a quiet intellectual dormancy induced by the comfort of assumed stability. The period that followed became an architectural reimagining of her entire life blueprint, where every choice, small or large, was subjected to rigorous personal vetting, discarding the inertia that had previously governed her movements. The implementation of this new philosophy found its most potent expression in her professional reawakening. Years prior, she had reluctantly placed a deeply fulfilling career in historical preservation architecture on indefinite pause, convinced that the demands of maintaining a conventional family equilibrium required her compromise. Now, she unearthed that dormant ambition, treating it not as a hobby, but as a critical instrument of self-definition. She immersed herself in the demanding, exacting work of restoring neglected, century-old structures, a process that served as a tangible metaphor for her internal reconstruction. The removal of rot, the stabilization of compromised foundations, and the meticulous layering of new, honest materials became the external expression of her internal, disciplined commitment to rebuilding integrity from the ground up. Furthermore, this dedication manifested in a radically altered approach to resource management. Time, once a commodity easily surrendered to the maintenance of the former illusion, was now treated as an inviolable asset. She became acutely aware of the emotional cost of ambiguity, refusing to invest energy in interactions or projects lacking transparent purpose or genuine commitment. She began to prioritize the difficult, meaningful effort over the comfortable, shallow distraction. The professional world, with its clear metrics of effort and verifiable success, provided the structural validation that her domestic life had catastrophically failed to deliver. Consequently, the architecture of her social life underwent a profound reorganization. The fractured network of acquaintances who had tacitly enabled the deceit was systematically pruned. She abandoned the reliance on inherited social structures, choosing instead to construct a self-selected community defined by intellectual curiosity and an unwavering commitment to epistemic honesty. She recognized that trust, once betrayed, could only be rebuilt through verified actions, not shared history. The new relationships she forged were with colleagues and mentors who valued rigor and verifiable output, individuals who challenged her intellectually and respected her defined boundaries. In stark contrast to the static, protective conformity of her old circle, her new alliances possessed a dynamic energy. She cultivated friendships that required critical engagement, seeking companions who offered perspective, not just validation. This shift was monumental. She moved away from people who prioritized maintaining the appearance of stability and toward those who actively celebrated the process of complex growth. This new geometry emphasized mutual respect, transforming social interaction from an obligation into a genuine forum for self-development. Ultimately, the goal transcended mere recovery. She had transmuted the raw material of betrayal, the shock, the investigative data, the pain, into a disciplined, non-negotiable standard for her future. Her life, post-confrontation, was not merely a return to normalcy. It represented an elevation to a higher plane of self-actualization. She had successfully navigated the turbulent waters of profound deception, emerging not as a diminished figure, but as an authority on her own resilience, an architect who had successfully rebuilt her foundation stronger than before. This period of meticulous self-construction served as the definitive final chapter of the trauma and the powerful opening act of her self-defined epic. The profound restructuring extended beyond her physical environment, encompassing a sophisticated process of temporal reclamation. She refused the conventional interpretation of those 6 years as simply wasted time. Instead, applying the rigorous methodology of a historian examining a fraudulent period, she intellectually relabeled the duration of the deception as involuntary field research. This cognitive reframing was not merely a linguistic trick, it was a deliberate act of separating her current identity from the casualty of the past. The time was not lost, it had been forcibly utilized to provide invaluable, albeit painful, data on human duplicity and systemic failure. By defining the past in terms of quantifiable experience rather than emotional deficit, she achieved an extraordinary intellectual distance, transforming memory from a debilitating burden into a catalog of strategic lessons. Building on this foundational stability, she began to apply principles of analytical strategy, models often reserved for high-stakes business negotiations, to her personal interactions. Recognizing that trust is fundamentally a matter of calculated risk assessment, she developed an internalized vulnerability index. This metric demanded consistent, verifiable action over rhetorical assurance from new acquaintances and potential partners. She prioritized behavioral data streams, meticulously observing the congruence between expressed intent and tangible outcome. If a commitment was made, she waited for its concrete delivery before investing further emotional capital. This was a guarded but realistic approach, ensuring that any future engagement would be predicated upon a foundation of established, repeatable integrity, thereby preventing the unconscious overinvestment that had characterized her former marriage. Furthermore, the expansion of her architectural firm provided a crucial opportunity for mentorship, which paradoxically solidified her internal wisdom. She took on a young, talented but organizationally chaotic protégé. The act of deconstructing and methodically simplifying the protégé's complex, interwoven professional failures, identifying the precise points of communication breakdown and boundary infringement, mirrored and reinforced the clarity she had sought in her personal crisis. By guiding another through the process of institutional self-correction and ethical mapping, she internalized the lessons of structure and transparency. She was not just teaching professional skills, she was disseminating a mandate for absolute personal accountability, reinforcing her own commitment through its external application. A distinct layer of her reconstruction involved the ethical disposition of tainted sentimental artifacts. She chose to focus not on the grand objects of betrayal, but on an inherited antique clock, a seemingly innocuous object purchased during a period when the deception was at its height. This clock, ticking relentlessly, had symbolized a steady march of time during which she remained ignorant. Rather than destroying it or allowing it to stand as a painful monument, she opted for a purposeful transmutation. She sold the piece to a specialized collector, dedicating the entire proceeds to a small, regional charity focused on funding ethical leadership programs for women entering difficult professional fields. This act transformed the monetary value derived from a moment of profound personal injury into a targeted investment in the moral fortitude of others, effectively cleansing the object's tainted history and transferring its symbolic weight into a positive, proactive force. Consequently, her journey culminated in the establishment of a formal public-facing initiative, moving beyond reactive coping to proactive ethical advocacy. Recognizing the ubiquity of trust erosion in modern social structures, she founded the Integrity Mapping Fellowship. This program provided specialized, intensive workshops focused on helping individuals define, protect, and communicate their non-negotiable personal and professional boundaries. It was a formalization of her lived experience, a mechanism designed to help others preemptively identify the subtle, insidious patterns of manipulation that precede catastrophic betrayal. By turning her private trauma into a public resource, she ensured that her experience would contribute tangibly to collective ethical awareness, confirming that self-actualization demanded not just personal success, but the active propagation of necessary wisdom. Following the exhaustive period of forensic and legal disentanglement, the woman's focus shifted inward, concentrating on the intricate neurobiological pathways of recovery. She recognized that the sustained stress of the deceit had manifested physically, leading to a dulling of her sensory environment. Consequently, she embarked on a deliberate campaign of somatic recalibration, seeking to rebuild the neurological connection between her emotional state and her physical reality. She immersed herself in disciplines that demanded absolute present-moment awareness, tuning out the distracting cacophony of the modern world. The goal was to dismantle the emotional numbness that had served as a necessary shield during the years of unconscious denial, allowing her body to truthfully register stimulus once more. The subtle texture of rain on glass, the nuanced scent of damp earth, the genuine ache of physical exertion, these were now welcome signals, reaffirming the validity of her own sensory intake, a critical departure from the manufactured reality she had once inhabited. In tandem with this physical commitment, she cultivated a profound respect for oral solitude. She actively sought environments devoid of human discourse, understanding that the greatest damage had been inflicted by spoken untruths and whispered omissions. She discovered an intense focus in the depths of high-altitude mountain ranges, dedicating weeks to solo treks where the primary sounds were the immutable forces of wind and glacial melt. This deep isolation fostered an unparalleled capacity for authentic self-dialogue. Stripped of external conversational static and the pressure of performative social interaction, her internal voice emerged with unvarnished clarity. This period of radical withdrawal was essential, functioning as a mental crucible that burned away the residual psychological contamination of the deceit, reinforcing her intellectual autonomy against external influence. Conversely, her approach to wealth management evolved dramatically, morphing from prudent asset protection to targeted social investment. She established a substantial, anonymously funded grant program designed to support independent female investigative journalists. These grants specifically targeted complex, long-form inquiries into institutional and corporate opacity, aiming to expose the systemic mechanisms of sustained white-collar deception. This was not mere philanthropy. It was a strategic deployment of capital, utilizing her financial leverage to fund the very type of rigorous truth-seeking that had ultimately liberated her. She sought to undermine the structural silence that protects fraud, transforming her personal injury into a catalytic force for public transparency and accountability in fields far removed from her own. To further anchor her rebuilt psychological framework, she embraced a demanding physical endeavor entirely separate from her intellectual pursuits. She committed years to competitive cyclocross racing. This sport, characterized by its brutal combination of cycling, running, and navigating unpredictable, often muddy terrain, demanded a unique synthesis of explosive power and grinding persistence. The immediate feedback loop of the race, where effort directly translated to velocity and failure was instantaneous and visible, served as a potent, non-negotiable metric for personal veracity. The physical pain and exhaustion became a preferred substitute for emotional suffering, providing a clean, verifiable expression of struggle and mastery. She found profound clarity in the relentless focus required to navigate the course, a moving meditation on forward momentum and resilience against frictional resistance. Finally, she dedicated significant intellectual energy to the study of natural sciences, particularly focusing on the immense, indifferent scale of cosmological time. Contemplating the deep history of the universe, the vast, measureless epochs that precede and succeed human existence, provided an extraordinary philosophical decompression. The 6 years of the betrayal, once viewed as a tragic and all-consuming loss, were reduced to a negligible fraction within this cosmic scale. This radical perspective shift diminished the perceived gravity of the personal offense, revealing it as an ephemeral human failure rather than a life-defining catastrophe. By embracing this larger temporal reality, she reinforced the profound imperative to prioritize conscious, meaningful action within her brief, vital window of existence, ensuring that her legacy would be defined by creation rather than reaction. She redirected her intense focus from external investigation to the demanding, unforgiving medium of large-scale ceramic sculpture. Unlike the calculated deceit she had uncovered, clay offered a brutal honesty. Fissures and structural flaws, once hidden, inevitably revealed themselves in the kiln's fierce heat. Her hands, accustomed to analyzing cold evidence, now mastered the delicate pressure required to cohere complex forms. One particularly significant work emerged from this period, a massive, hollow vessel, deliberately left unglazed on the exterior, bearing the rough, natural scars of its firing. This piece symbolized the beauty found in exposed vulnerability. She refused to hide the inherent structural imperfections, choosing instead to stabilize them with gold-infused resin, a Japanese kintsugi-inspired technique applied not to repair, but to unequivocally celebrate the history of fracture. Intellectually, she gravitated toward the ancient tenets of existential philosophy, finding profound solace in the radical acceptance of events outside her sphere of influence. The betrayal, she concluded, was merely a catastrophic outcome of another individual's flawed will, entirely independent of her own intrinsic value. She systematically dismantled the destructive notion that her well-being required external certification, whether from a partner, a community, or a predefined societal structure. This rigorous intellectual commitment required a constant vigilance, actively resisting the subtle, persistent pull of self-pity and choosing instead the disciplined clarity of recognizing only the inputs she could genuinely govern: her effort, her ethical reaction, and her continued pursuit of personalized meaning. This rigorous mental training became her most reliable, enduring defense against future emotional chaos. Consequently, when she eventually considered new intimate connections, her internal criteria had fundamentally shifted away from conventional expectations. She no longer sought refuge or traditional domestic security. Rather, she sought intellectual parity and a shared, proactive commitment to radical transparency. A prospective partner was viewed less as a romantic anchor and more as a potential co-explorer, someone willing to navigate the inevitable complexities of life openly without the desperate need for comfortable, self-protective lies. She found herself naturally drawn to individuals whose professional lives mirrored this required integrity: scientists, empirical researchers, and ethicists, people whose very careers demanded a rigorous fidelity to verifiable, observable facts. She understood that genuine future joy would be found not in the absence of interpersonal challenge, but in the shared, honest labor of navigating inevitable relational friction. Building on this philosophical foundation, she initiated a non-monetary legacy project rooted in environmental stewardship. She purchased and began the meticulous, decades-long process of reforesting a substantial tract of deforested land in a remote, protected watershed. This work, slow and often physically grueling, operated on a timescale that vastly exceeded the duration of her personal injury. Planting a nascent oak or a fragile cedar offered a direct, observable causality. Present effort guaranteed future, verifiable growth. This enduring work provided a grounding contrast to the swift, devastating collapse of her former domestic life, teaching patience and providing a tangible measure of her power to create permanent, beneficial change in the world, quite apart from human relationships. Crucially, she resolved the complex matter of shared culpability involving her former social circle. She ceased attributing malicious, active intent to everyone who had remained silent during the affair. Instead, she viewed their sustained inaction as a demonstration of profound moral weakness, a collective failure of personal courage, not necessarily a personal vendetta against her. This distinction was vital for her final emotional liberation. It allowed her to release the corrosive bitterness associated with feeling hunted, replacing it with a simple, clinical recognition that most people instinctually choose the path of least resistance to maintain social equilibrium. This ethical reconciliation, where moral weakness was differentiated from active malice, finalized her emotional divestment from the entire incident. She had, in effect, granted them a detached diagnosis of structural social mediocrity, thereby completely releasing herself from their judgment and the burden of their shared, dishonest history. Now, consider how this rigorous intellectual separation can apply when you face similar betrayals of trust. Where do you draw the essential line between unfortunate cowardice and deliberate injury? The trajectory of her recovery demanded more than emotional healing. It required a rigorous deconstruction of her own perceptual failures. She initiated an intensive, self-directed curriculum focused on cognitive psychology, specifically scrutinizing the array of heuristics and biases that lead to willful blindness. Her past self, she realized, had succumbed to a profound normalcy bias, interpreting the absence of definitive evidence of betrayal as irrefutable proof of marital fidelity. This intellectual rigor transformed her history from a source of shame into a sophisticated case study in human interpretive error. Understanding the systematic mechanisms by which the brain seeks convenient narrative closure became essential to her future self-protection, immunizing her against the comforting seduction of unverified assumptions. Leveraging the specialized understanding, she launched an innovative boutique consultancy, diverging sharply from her architectural roots. This firm specialized not in recovering lost assets, but in providing integrity audits for complex, mid-sized institutions. The goal was to detect the structural preconditions for ethical misconduct, the subtle failures in oversight, the ambiguous reporting lines, and the fear-based internal cultures that, much like her former marriage, fostered environments where deception could flourish unchecked. She applied a form of industrial forensics, identifying the latent weaknesses in corporate governance before they materialized as catastrophic fraud. Her methodology demanded complete transparency from clients, often forcing uncomfortable confrontations with their own organizational complacency. Consequently, she imposed an unyielding standard of digital sovereignty upon her own life. Recognizing that the modern locus of betrayal often resides in the digital realm, she became a serious student of advanced encryption and secure network architecture. She established a personal, highly encrypted communication perimeter, treating all external digital exchanges as fundamentally suspect until verification could be achieved through a multi-factor methodology she personally designed. This was not paranoia, but rather the practical application of lessons learned. If the core infrastructure of communication is compromised, all subsequent intimacy is illusory. She viewed absolute digital hygiene as a non-negotiable prerequisite for emotional availability. However, data alone could not sustain a life rebuilt on trust. The human element, the subtle instinctual knowledge that precedes empirical proof, remained critical. She sought to reconcile her newfound devotion to evidence with the soft signals of intuition she had previously ignored. This calibration required intensive practice in filtering the noise of daily life to isolate genuine subconscious alerts, a form of neurological meditation focused on sensory input awareness. She trained herself to treat a sudden, inexplicable sense of cognitive dissonance not as anxiety to be dismissed, but as a low-level data alarm requiring immediate, rational investigation. This balance, respecting the wisdom of the gut while demanding its validation through documented fact, became the cornerstone of her renewed sense of self-trust. Another crucial layer of her current life involved an unexpected fascination with the field of horology. She began acquiring the skills of a watchmaker, drawn to the unforgiving, microscopic precision demanded by antique mechanical movements. She found a profound, meditative comfort in examining the verifiable function of hundreds of tiny, interdependent components, each required to perform its task with absolute, measurable accuracy for the whole to function truthfully. This meticulous craft served as a potent, constant metaphor for the ideal relationship. Every gear must move with integrity, and no single piece could afford to conceal its true motion without collapsing the entire system. Now, consider how you approach the early, foundational signs of misalignment in your own life. Do you pause to conduct an honest audit, or do you instinctively choose the comfort of the unexamined assumption? Reflecting on this journey so far, one discerns not a linear path of recovery, but a complex, nearly geophysical shift in fundamental perspective. The initial shock, the intellectual equivalent of a catastrophic seismic event, ultimately forced a profound reconstruction of the protagonist's internal architecture. The rubble of the shared past was not simply swept away. Rather, it was systematically analyzed for its structural components, revealing the inherent flaws in a foundation built upon unchecked assumptions. The chaos of revelation, so devastating in its immediate impact, paradoxically yielded an extraordinary clarity, forcing the abandonment of comfortable delusion in favor of an unyielding, if harsh, epistemological bedrock. This new reality is defined by an absolute commitment to verifiable truth. The protagonist effectively replaced the fragile machinery of romantic expectation with the robust engineering of empirical discipline. Where once she relied on the soft assurances of emotional declarations, she now operates solely on the hard data of consistent action. This intellectual armor, forged in the intense heat of deception, shields against the corrosive power of ambiguity. It is the realization that personal boundaries must function less as permeable membranes and more as rigorously monitored, ethical perimeters, ensuring that only verified commitment, not mere assertion, is permitted entry into the intimate domain of self. The cumulative effect of this discipline is the establishment of a sovereignty that is both absolute and self-sustaining, a powerful engine of autonomy that requires no external validation to function. The subtle, insidious implications of the betrayal extended far beyond the marital contract, touching the wider ecosystem of social complicity. The silent consent of the surrounding community, the shared reluctance to disrupt the appearance of order, emerges as a chilling secondary layer of the fraud. This inertia suggests that the preservation of social ease often eclipses the moral imperative of truth. The protagonist's subsequent response, the creation of systems designed to force transparency in institutional settings, represents the transmutation of personal injury into public ethical capacitance. By analyzing the mechanisms of the deceit, the structural hiding places, and the operational lapses that permitted the parallel reality to persist, she shifted from questioning her own judgment to auditing the systemic failures that enable such sustained duplicity in any environment, large or small. The rigorous physical and intellectual disciplines she embraced, the patient, demanding focus on the verifiable output of her hands and mind, are not simply therapeutic diversions. They are, collectively, a declaration of intent, a perpetual commitment to self-mastery. The pain of the past was transformed into a disciplined, kinetic energy, driving an unrelenting forward momentum. She internalized the profound lesson that one must become the most reliable witness to one's own life, possessing the capacity to look unflinchingly at discomforting facts without flinching or retreating into rationalization. This continuous process of self-refinement, this relentless drive toward a coherence between internal conviction and external expression, is the silent triumph of her long endeavor. It is the sophisticated alchemy that converts the base metal of suffering into the unassailable resilience of genuine, self-directed purpose. As we approach the culmination of this exploration, we must recognize that the woman's ultimate achievement lies not in escaping the past, but in leveraging it as the essential, unshakable blueprint for a future defined by intentionality. The narrative shifts now from the meticulous process of her reconstruction to the profound implications of her integrated wisdom. It compels us to consider how we, too, measure integrity and what price we assign to the unverified comforts of assumed reality. The architecture of her resilience stands complete, ready to transmit its final, resonant lesson regarding the indispensable relationship between self-knowledge and authentic living. The true culmination of this profound personal and investigative journey resides not in the successful dissolution of a fraudulent marriage, but in the radical intellectual autonomy forged within the wreckage. The woman, whose life became an unexpected case study in sustained deception, ultimately discovered that the most devastating revelation was not the existence of the lie itself, but the immense, previously untapped power required to meticulously dismantle it. She emerged from the shadow of betrayal, realizing that the greatest loss in her former life was the quiet surrender of her own forensic capacity, the willingness to accept convenient, untested narratives over the uncomfortable rigor of objective truth. Her reconstruction is therefore less a story of emotional healing and more a definitive testament to the supreme, irreplaceable value of earned self-trust. The systemic nature of the deceit, upheld by the comfortable silence of a complicit social circle, illuminated a chilling truth about communal vulnerability. It demonstrated that trust, particularly in entrenched relationships, often relies on a collective agreement to ignore inconvenient facts, prioritizing social equilibrium over individual integrity. By rejecting this passive acceptance, she engineered a life designed for anti-fragility. Every facet of her rebuilt existence, from the rigorous, fact-based criteria applied to her architectural firm's audits to the uncompromising digital perimeter established around her personal communication, serves as a physical and intellectual bulwark against the re-entry of ambiguity. She transitioned from a life governed by hope and assumption to one predicated entirely on verifiable, measurable data. This philosophical shift found its most eloquent expression in her artistic and contemplative pursuits. The intentional scarring of her ceramic sculptures, stabilized and highlighted with precious metals, stands as a tangible manifesto. Fracture is not an endpoint, but a necessary stage in achieving a higher, more complex form of beauty. Similarly, her dedication to the unforgiving precision of horology and the profound detachment offered by cosmological study anchors her to realities far removed from the petty mechanisms of human dishonesty. These disciplines enforce an intellectual humility and a profound respect for measurable truth. The silence of the mountain ranges and the relentless precision of the mechanical gears became the trusted voices in her life, incapable of false promises. Ultimately, the pain of the revelation was transformed into an irreversible investment. She did not merely survive the betrayal, she utilized it as an accelerator toward complete self-actualization. She purchased, at an excruciating emotional price, an unassailable understanding of her own moral sovereignty. Her current life serves as a living, continuous proof that resilience is not a mystical trait, but an applied discipline, a relentless commitment to coherence between one's internal ethical conviction and external manifestation. She successfully achieved the ultimate severance, disentangling her worth from the moral failures of another, ensuring that the legacy of her marriage would be defined not by its collapse, but by the extraordinary strength unearthed in its aftermath. This trajectory offers a universal lens through which to examine the deepest risks inherent in human connection. It forces a critical evaluation of the subtle compromises made daily in the name of comfort or stability, compelling an honest assessment of how deeply we allow the narratives of others to define our own reality. The woman's journey concludes not with a simple closure, but with a resonant challenge, derived from the profound solitude and clarity of her reconstructed life. It is a vital inquiry into the fundamental architecture of personal security that transcends the specifics of infidelity, addressing the core human need for authentic connection. Having witnessed the meticulous dismantling of a life built on sand, we are left to ponder the foundational components of our own most cherished bonds, asking ourselves, when the comfortable narratives fail and the silence breaks, what is the single greatest point of vulnerability you carry into the intimate act of trusting another?